What's up, y'all? It's Dev, and today we're going to take a look at what is actually seeing play from Tarkir Dragonstorm. One of the most anticipated sets since I started doing YouTube, and that's been about a decade now. So, I should tell you something. A lot of people are excited for this set. So, did it go bust, or are there actually things from this set that are powerful in Standard at the very least? And yeah, turns out there's over 20 cards that have already impacted Standard in some way, some way better than others. So, let's go ahead and jump into things with only a couple of quick disclaimers here. One, just because a card hasn't seen play in the first 7 days it was available to play in Standard does not mean it will never see play in Standard. These cards have a few years to do so, but I guess the opposite is true as well. Just because a card is seeing play in the first week doesn't mean that it's an incredible Magic card that will continue to see play until the end of time. Not necessarily true. The other disclaimer I want to briefly mention is that all of these results, I guess, all the cards I'm going to show you come from MTGO League and Challenge results throughout this first week. This is not like cards I've seen on Arena a bunch of times or anything like that. It's nothing to do with like what's popular in the current Arena meta or anything like that. These are all cards that have popped up in, MTGO results so far from tournaments and also from League. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into it. You obviously see the first card here is United Battlefront. There's a reason this is the first card we're looking at. This card hasn't been too impactful, and when it does show up in challenge results, it's often out of the top 16. So people are still trying to play the card in various decks, often a sort of mono white deck, sometimes a sort of red-white deck with Urbrass Forge and Caretaker's Talent and stuff like that, but it's in a couple of different things. It's popped up in Simulacrum Synthesizer list at least one time that I've seen this season, so card is trying to do a couple of things, but it hasn't really done much. That said, it's done a lot more than a bunch of other cards in the set, and that it's actually shown up in League results so far this season, so it says something. But we'll move on to Carsey Revenant, another card that I haven't seen too often, but I have seen it both in Dimir decks with like Enduring Curiosity and stuff like that, but it's also been in a couple of graveyard centric decks. I think that one of the more exciting decks this week was a new Golgari deck. As a matter of fact, Golgari has tried to make its mark and really hang on in Standard and has been doing so very well, but when it does so, when it actually pops up in League and Challenge results, it's doing so with some of the brand new cards like Carsey Revenant here. So neat. One time I'll mention Arena in this video. I have seen people play this with Urberg Lorgoyfs and Souls of the Lost and whatnot, and it's an interesting card in decks like that. Pretty good, but has nothing to do with MTGO results. It's just a cool way I've seen the card used, but it has popped up in a few, especially Dimir lists. That's mostly where it's likely to show up. But there's also Frontline Rush. Jeskai Convoke has not been super popular this season, and as the season goes on, just this first week, it gets less and less popular as we get more and more League results. But as we have seen some Convoke decks so far this season in Standard, a lot of them include a 2-up Frontline Rush. It's easy to see why. It's a couple of creatures, kind of like a Resolute Reinforcements if you didn't get that creature. But it's also liable to get a creature through for an extra 6 damage in this deck. So Rush is pretty good. I played it in Mardu Mobilize, had a lot of fun with it. Voice of Victory is another card that's showing up in the Jeskai Convoke decks, but again, those decks haven't been super popular, and the popularity has been dwindling as the season goes on, and other aggro decks take the forefront. We'll talk about them a little bit more towards the end of the video, but Voice of Victory has been in a few results that I've seen, but again, kind of as the season goes on, it's tapering off. Herd Heirloom is another one that showed up in a few funky decks that haven't gotten the best results in the world, but have gotten results nonetheless, right? So you got to bring it up. This is one that's been in a Gruul kind of mid-range deck that I've seen with a bunch of creatures. But most recently, the deck that I saw it in was Phyrexian Obliterator, Golgari Obliterator. And pretty good in that deck, because it helps you get your Obliterator faster. It makes mana of any color, so long as you're casting a creature. So, and it's also kind of cool to tap down once you have Obliterator in play. So, neat little card here. I figured it would see some play at some point during its Standard life cycle, but I wasn't sure it would happen this fast. And I wasn't sure it would happen in the decks that it's happening in so far, at least. But there's also Roiling Dragonstorm, which is specifically in Pixie decks. A few cards get put into Pixie from time to time. There's one in particular that has really given that deck another new lease on life. I feel like after the Pro Tour when it kind of got forced out of the top 8, despite the fact that everyone thought for a moment it was the best deck in Standard. I feel like that deck has kind of been on the downswing, less and less people paying attention to it or playing it or really taking it as seriously as they used to. But it got one card in particular, again, that kind of resurrected it. And this ain't it, but it does show up from time to time. You see a 1/2 of Roiling Dragonstorm in every 4th Esper Pixie list. So it's not a card that is completely shut out of seeing Standard play, but I feel like as the season goes on, we may see less of these in the Pixie decks, but who knows, right? Maybe it'll actually end up being a 3 of at some point, but we'll see about it. Desperate Measures is one that shows up in these Rakdos aggro decks. Kind of interesting that those decks are becoming even more Rakdos. It used to just be Callous Sellsword, and it's, adventure half. And sometimes those decks wouldn't even have black mana in them to cast Callous Sellsword, just the red mana for the adventure. Now we're seeing a more Rakdos-focused deck that often includes a 2 to even 4 of Desperate Measures because it's really awesome to have a Skull Clamp effect in that deck. This can either be a removal spell or a kind of Village Rites effect on your turn. And all that is actually really cool. It also allows you to sacrifice your Heartfire hero and do a bunch of damage, right? So altogether, cool little card. I say sacrifice, but it kind of depends on how much damage your hero's taking that turn, right? So that all depends. But one way or the other, it is a neat little card. That has done a fair number of things in Standard so far, but only really in one aggro deck. And I don't think it's the strongest aggro deck in Standard. So there's also Winter Night Stories as we look at a couple of cards here that are affecting the playability of Jeskai Oculus. I think a few things are affecting the playability of that deck. Most notably, and probably one that a lot of people don't think about, the also playability of the Omniscience deck, right? Both of these are graveyard-focused decks. One is way more aggressive than the other, Oculus, right? But first couple of turns of the game, the way both of these decks play, you're not necessarily sure which one you're playing against, right? Turn 1 Meticulous Archive means nothing in that situation. So you might be setting up to play against Omniscience, and then you get your face punched in by a bunch of little red dudes, which is how, Oculus is built nowadays, weirdly enough. But in those same Oculus decks, we often see a 2 of Winter Night Stories, and those decks have been pretty popular. And honestly, as the last couple of days go on, they seem to be even more popular over the last, again, couple of days of league results and especially challenges. They've been doing very well. But Stories is a good part of that, and the deck has plenty of creatures to, harmonize the card pretty easily. But there's also Glacial Dragon Hunt, which shows up in those decks as, again, like a 2 of a lot of the time. You don't see a ton of copies of this, but interesting way to set up an Oculus on turn 2, right? Because you're going to get your Oculus on turn 3. You dump it in the yard with the Dragon Hunt. You'll draw a card. You can harmonize it later to get, another removal thing going, or just dig deeper into your deck, or maybe pitch another Oculus, whatever, right? So cool little card here that I figured would see some play. I just wasn't sure it would be Oculus, but obviously, it's a really good home for the card. Deck is looking for a couple of more removal spells that needed some interaction, right? And this is a good way of getting it while still doing everything the deck wants to do. So sick little card here. But there's also Surak, Elusive Hunter, a card that's shown up a few places, but most notably Golgari so far. I've seen this in a couple of places. It was in a little Gruul kind of mice deck as a 1 of, right? But, there's these Golgari decks where it often shows up as a 2 of, and it's not in every one, but it's often main deckable. There's so much good removal in Standard. Every deck plays incredible 1 and 2 mana removal. I could start naming it, but we'd be here for another 15 minutes, adding a lot of runtime if I do that. So, even that little interlude took less time than doing it, but still, this just makes it to where you keep up the card advantage race against decks that have all that good removal, which is every deck. So good little dude here that is pretty good on stats too. So Rock Curse Rakshasa is another one that's showing up not only in that more Rakdos focused kind of mono red aggro deck. You don't see it every time. You also see Desperate Measures, but you occasionally see a 2 of Rock Curse Rakshasa in those decks. But you'll also see a 2 of, and again, Golgari decks. This is another one that Golgari decks have been kind of experimenting with for a couple of reasons. It is a demon, so that counts for Unholy Annex, right? But also gets through a fair number of damage points in the early game, kind of like that about it. But in the late game, it can get through a board full full of who knows, right? Like Glissas or Mosswood Dread Knights or Preacher of the Schisms or Sheldrids or whatever, right? So pretty good at doing that depending on what the board situation is and how much mana you have. So Rockhurst just, kind of works out more in Golgari than I kind of thought it would, but any Unholy Annex deck is kind of playing this right now as at least the 2 of. There's also Elspeth Stormslayer. This may be the last card before we get into a whole chunk of one deck that is starting to do really well in Standard, but sometimes you'll see Elspeth Stormslayer in that. We'll get to it in a second, but for the most part, you see Elspeth Stormslayer in these kind of mono-white decks that, again, were resurgent towards the beginning of the season, these last 3 days or so, and I know it's not a huge chunk of time, but you're just seeing less and less of this mono-white pile. But, again, it kind of had a little bit of a comeback. A little bit, return of the Mac because of Elspeth Stormslayer here. And usually a 2 of or whatever, but obviously a good card in that deck. And it's a content creator card. I've seen it in just about every YouTuber's decks so far this season, but, it hasn't seen as much play in Standard immediately, at least, as I think a lot of us would have assumed. But it has shown up, quite a bit, again, in the deck that it's like obviously slots into, no-brainer, right? So when it shows up, it shows up. But Dragonologist is next, the first in a line of Jeskai cards. We've already looked at the Oculus cards, but there's a Jeskai kind of control deck that can sometimes just straight up be Jeskai Dragons, depending on the build. Who knows what you're going to get. And sometimes cards that we're not necessarily going to talk too much about today, like Twin Maw Stormbrood, will show up in that deck, but not as often as cards like Dragonologist, and this is probably the card that has shown up the least in those Jeskai Dragons decks. But when it is specifically a Dragons-focused deck, you'll sometimes see the 1 or 2 of Dragonologist. I think it's pretty good play. This digs for a lot of cards, right, and can find a bunch of important stuff in your deck, whether you're looking for a sweep or a split up maybe to kind of control the board state, or a stock up, or a dragon, right? There's a ton of those in the deck too. So card finds a lot of things while also being, a little roadblock, speed bump for the opponent to attack through. So like this card. There's also Dispelling Exhale. Again, when the deck is specifically Dragons focused, you'll often see at least a 2 of this, but it can be all the way up to a 4 of depending on the build. But usually people settle on that happy medium and play the 3 of, right? It's like playing a Phantom Interference or something, but often this is, potentially better than a Mana Leak on turn 2 of the game. So just a really, really powerful counterspell here. And counterspells are pretty good right now, it turns out. There's also Jeskai Revelation, which you'll occasionally catch a 1 of in the main deck. And then more often, you'll see a 2 of in sideboards. For, I guess, long games or whatever, it does cost 7 mana. So you have to be kind of careful about playing this card in your deck. But that doesn't keep it from showing up in main decks. Maybe not the most relevant card in the new Jeskai piles, but it is there at the very least. There's also Rediscover the Way here. This is a great hit off of Shiko, and it kind of puts itself in the graveyard for Shiko, like on time, right? You play it on turn 3, on turn 2, or on turn 4, you get the second chapter. On turn 5, it goes off, and then you play Shiko with your 5 mana, you get it back, right? So you can basically get this for like 4 turns in a row, and casting Anticipate 4 turns in a row is like really good. It's fantastic. I called this a stock up effect not long ago, and a guy got like really mad at me in the comment section. I apologize, but it is an Anticipate effect twice, but that kind of equals stock up. To my credit, if you looking at 6 cards and you put 2 into your hand, I wager that's better than stock up, especially the people are gonna throw stones at me, and rightfully so in some ways, but save your tomatoes for another day. I'm sure I'll make a worse steak than that. The second time that you get the Anticipate effect, you have all your mana untapped, which is just like wild to cast Anticipate with your mana untapped. So I think this is very good, and obviously like swinging in with like Shiko for 8 or another dragon in the deck for like 12 it's just like absolutely silly. So let's not discount this last chapter either, but these first 2 chapters are just crazy. And again, this one doesn't show up all the time either, but it shows up more than any card that we've looked at so far. If the deck plays 4 Shiko, it will often play 4 stock up to Rediscover the Way as like, sorry again, but like copies 5 and 6 of stock up. Like that, it effectively is that. I'm sorry, but stock up doesn't deal 1 million combat damage if you play your cards right. But that said, there's also Quarry Mountain Monastery. Surprisingly, this has seen more play in Standard than Mistrise Village, the blue one, right? Which is the one everyone was talking about. It's probably the one that people are buying the most for Commander. Mistrise Village is the most expensive one in the set as far as this land cycle goes. But Quarry Mountain Monastery, you can get this for just $1 right now. This card is actually really, really cheap, and not only is it also seeing some play in Commander, or at least what people are building on EDA track right now. But it's also seeing a fair amount of play in standard. Again, in this Jeskai deck specifically, but in the very sparing number of like Boros, Forge, Elspeth decks or whatever I've seen so far this season, they also play the one of Monastery. So cool little card here. It's just card advantage. This kind of is just that. So if the game goes long, draw yourself some extra cards. Why not? Shiko, Paragon of the Way, is the second last of these Jeskai specific cards, but this will sometimes be a 3-of, sometimes a 4-of, but not usually less than that. You know, if it's less than 3 Shiko, it's 0 Shiko for the most part. But that build is getting less and less popular as people like realize how powerful Shrimp Dragon is. It always looks like a shrimp. When I was a kid, we had like a saltwater aquarium at my house, and this dragon looks just like a shrimp that we had. It was like a peppermint shrimp or something. It just looks exactly like a shrimp. But this can get stock up out of your yard. You can play split up out of your yard, and you choose tap creatures, or sometimes depending on how dire the situation is, just choose untapped and bye-bye Shiko. You'll get them back later, whatever. But still, sometimes you can also choose again, Rediscover the Way, right? There's a ton of really good hits for this in the Jeskai deck. So shouldn't be too surprised, but more than just about any card, this is the one that has single-handedly made Jeskai Dragon Control like a real deck this season, and it is. It shows up all the time. But apart from that, another card that kind of bridges the gap between Jeskai Control, or Dragons, if you prefer, and Omniscience is Morang River Regent. This is like the only card that I've really seen Omniscience playing that's like brand new from Tarkir Dragonstorm, but they're picking it up, right? At the beginning of the season, it was just straight up Omniscience, but nowadays you're more likely to see a 2-of Morang River Regent, which is actually really, really cool, man. You know, it's a sweet card for just about any like control-y deck, or especially decks that want to pitch cards into their graveyard. Again, like Omniscience, right? So sweet card just for its Omen half, but obviously the dragon half of it is great. And again, would Rediscover the Way peels off that third chapter. You fly over for 12, you win the game. It's a wild card, man. But I think next, let me make sure. Yeah, you didn't see that card. I think next that we've only got about 3 more cards to look at from Tarkir Dragonstorm that are affecting standard this season. But that said, there's another thing I want to talk about, but to do so, I think I need to calm down slightly because I have been a little bit up this video. You know what I mean? I've been trying to talk as quickly as I possibly can to get through like 50 cards or whatever. So let's bring our blood pressure down just a little bit. Let's prop our feet up by the fire. Let's put on our green aprons. Let's have ourselves a nice little coffee break. This week on the coffee break, we're going to talk about 5 cards that are seeing standard play thanks to Tarkir Dragonstorm. These cards are not necessarily from Tarkir Dragonstorm. However, they are cards that have been very powerful since the moment of their release and have yet to see too much standard play. But that is changing thanks to certain Tarkir Dragonstorm cards. The first one I want to take a look at is Wishclaw Talisman here. Obviously a powerful commander piece that still fetches at least a few dollars, but has never really seen too much standard play. That said, this is showing up as a 1 or even a 2-of in certain Esper Pixie lists, and that is because you can play a Sun Pearl Kirin at instant speed once you activate the Wishclaw Talisman to pop it back to your hand and keep it from going to your opponent. A powerful play indeed that is very, very clever. But there's also Chandra, Hope's Beacon, another very powerful card that has not seen too much standard play up to now, but is starting to see more thanks to the Jeskai control lists. Those lists don't always play this card, but very often in control, you definitely want a large planeswalker to close the games out. Chandra, Hope's Beacon is the best planeswalker that deck has for doing so. There's also Rin's Resolve, which is seeing play not only in the Quarry Steel Cutter decks, excuse me and pardon me, I apologize, but also in certain PNA Lar decks, which is starting to see play as well with some of these new cards. But last card we're going to look at for the coffee break this week is Marauding Mako. That's not even true. I believe there's one more to look at after this. You see why I like to be able to do multiple takes when I do a coffee break. That said, Marauding Mako is also in these Jeskai Oculus decks, amazingly enough, and that is mostly because of one new creature from Tarkir Dragonstorm that we will talk about momentarily once I go back to my dev voice. That said, Marauding Mako is now a full 4-of in Jeskai Oculus, and even though it didn't get its due in Standard when it was first released, now it has the perfect pile. Apart from that, the actual last card I want to bring up for the coffee break is Slick Sequence, which does not always see play in Izzet Cutter decks, but when it does, I pop every time. Slick Sequence is a very slick Magic card indeed, and I'm always going to be happy when it sees more play. But that is all for the coffee break this week. Let's go back to Dev. In this moment in time, right now, you will see the transformation right before your very eyes. Hey, what's up, guys? What happened there? I have no idea where I was for a second. Look, we got 3 more cards left that have probably had the absolute most effect on Standard. Why is Slick Sequence on screen? That's not in Tarkir Dragonstorm. It's so weird. Anyway, the next card I want to look at is Sun Pearl Kirin, which I feel like I just brought up, but I don't think so. Either way, this is in the Esper Pixie decks, and it is for sure like the best new card from Tarkir Dragonstorm for that deck. Again, there's a couple seeing play, Roiling Dragonstorm, and I've even seen a couple of other cards pop up like once, but Sun Pearl Kirin went from a tentative 2 of, people were still playing like a 4 of Nurturing Pixie, 4 of Fear of Isolation, and then they like slip in a 2 of Sun Pearl Kirin. It doesn't make any sense, just play the 4 of Sun Pearl Kirin and knock Isolation down to a 2 of, right? And that is what a lot of decks started to do. Now, though, over the last 3 days or 4 days even, you're more likely to just see 12 creatures that bounce, right? 4 Fear of Isolation, 4 Nurturing Pixie, 4 Sun Pearl Kirin. But Kirin has a chance at being the most powerful of all of these because it enables a bunch of tricks like Wishclaw Talisman, which again, I feel like I just told you guys that, but I didn't. I wasn't there. What happened a minute ago? One way or the other, I got to stop doing that bit. This is obviously just a really good card for the Pixie decks. It always was. If there was one card that was for sure going to see Standard play, guaranteed, because it already slots into a deck, it was Kirin, so no one is surprised. One that people might be surprised by is Tursa Lightshatter, a very good-looking Magic card that turned out to be everything everyone wanted it to be. 3 mana, 2 and a red for a 3/3 Orc Wizard with haste. It's legendary. When it enters, pitch 2, draw that many cards, up to 2, draw that many cards. But when it attacks, if there are 70 more cards in your yard, you exile a card at random from your yard, you play it that turn. So this is showing up in like 3 different decks. It's showing up in certain cutter decks, but it's also showing up in just regular old mono red, no Corey Steel Cutter. And maybe most importantly, it's showing up in these, Azorius Oculus decks. This is probably the best hit that those decks got. It got a few good cards, don't get me wrong. And honestly, there's a lot of stuff from Dragonstorm is why Oculus is good again. But all that said, Tursa Lightshatter, the ability to pitch 2 and then draw 2 is, Kiora. That's basically Kiora, but Kiora doesn't attack with haste. Kiora doesn't have 3 toughness. Kiora can die to cut down. Kiora doesn't have this other ability that's specifically very, very good in Oculus, right? Because it turns out that, you get 7 cards in your yard, like by the time this guy's attacking on 3 sometimes. Like definitely by the time it's attacking on turn 4. So just a massive card here. I wasn't sure that this bottom line of text would ever really do too much in Standard, but again, Oculus is the absolute perfect deck for it, and that first line of text where you get to like pitch 2, draw 2 is wild. It's just very, very good. Those decks have basically stopped playing Kiora, the ones that were, right? Just to play Lightshatter instead. It increases the speed of the deck. It increases the defense of the deck in some ways because, again, it doesn't die to cut down and stuff. And Torch the Tower, like a dry Torch the Tower or a Shock or something, or a dry Burst Lightning. It doesn't die to those like Kiora does. And again, that's a fairly big upgrade. So just a slick little dude here that's showing up like kind of everywhere. Like if you play Mountains, you kind of play Tursa Lightshatter, which is amazing. But another card that you kind of play when you play Mountains is Corey Steel Cutter. Definitely like the #1 most played new card from Tarkir Dragonstorm, man. This one was on my honorable mentions in the top 50, and I think I said something like, it's either the best card in the set or it's never going to see play. And apparently it's the best card in the set. So some alternate universe version of Dead won that flip. I'm not sure it was me, but somebody won that coin flip. Either way, this is seeing play in mono red. It's seeing play in a bunch of other weird builds and stuff. Like you'll see Cutter anything, you know what I mean? But maybe the most notable build is Izzet Cutter, which is, if not the best deck in Standard, it's like in the top 3. It might be the best aggro deck in Standard. And it might be also like the interesting category here, the most fun deck to play in Standard as well. In some way, the deck is so fun. It feels like playing a Legacy deck. Izzet spells in Legacy when it was when it was type 1, you know what I mean? Like back in 1997, like Lightning Bolt, Ancestral Recall, I'm just pitching like 1-mana spells and doing crazy stuff. And like Izzet Cutter kind of feels like doing that. You're playing like Monastery Swift Spear, a bunch of good burn. You're playing Storm Chaser's Talent and stuff, and you're just going crazy. So deck is really, really fun to just like sling it around, you know what I mean? So cool deck, but you know, apart from being fun, it's also really, really powerful. Super strong deck. But again, Cutter's been in a bunch of stuff this season so far, and I imagine it's not going to go like the way of Cryptic Code or anything. Somebody on Twitter the other day said, like, do you think Corey Steel Cutter is going to end up like Cryptic Code? And I was kind of surprised by the number of people that were getting them. I feel bad because people were like, it's nothing like Cloak. And it's like, I think people forget how powerful Cryptic Code was for the first couple of months. And like a lot of people played it and then it kind of died out. And I think that that's his point. Like, will Corey Steel Cutter have the same story? And I don't think so, to be honest. I think it is like way more powerful than Coat in a lot of ways and hard to even compare, but I get why they did that. But either way, man, good card here to say the least, but there's a ton of really good cards in the set I hope we illustrated in this video, and probably even more that we'll see standard play before it's all said and done. But anyway, that's all I got for this one. Hope it was somewhat informative. Got a bunch of other videos coming out. That's how people run a YouTube channel. I'm no different. So make sure you subscribe to the channel, sub to the sandwich to get the content. You can hit the thumb button on the way out. And of course, I have a Patreon, www.patreon.com/SBMTG. Put those words into your address bar, and you too can give me $1 a month to support the content. That'll also let you vote on content. So if you want power, give me $1 a month, and I will give you a tiny amount of power. It's not much, but it is power. Imagine it. But either way, that's all I've got for now, guys. I'm going to put this one up. I don't even have to edit it. I'm just going to shoot it straight onto the YouTube. So I'll see you guys in a second. I'm Dev. Bye.